Imagine, just for a second, having the entire known world at your fingertips by the time you're only 20 years old. It's almost impossible to comprehend, right? Now, most historical accounts you read are going to paint him as this golden boy, an absolute tactical genius who literally never lost a single battle. But in this explainer, we're diving into the darker, much more terrifying reality hidden just beneath that shining myth. We're going to look at the story of how a brilliant young king conquered the earth, only to be completely consumed by absolute power, crippling paranoia, and a god complex that ultimately tore his world apart.
To the Persians, he was Alexander the Accursed, but to the West, he was immortalized as Alexander the Great. You know, the truth of who this man really was lies somewhere in the dangerous, murky shadows between those two extremes. And the descent into darkness we're about to explore, well, it began long before he ever marched a single army into Asia.
Section 1. Heir to a bloody throne. The Macedonian Shadow.
Okay, so Alexander's story doesn't begin with some noble, heroic quest. It begins in the brutal, incredibly cutthroat courts of ancient Macedonia. Just look at the ruthless efficiency of how he actually takes power. Step 1. His father, King Philip II, is assassinated by his own bodyguard. Step 2. Literally overnight, the 20-year-old Alexander claims the throne. But he doesn't just quietly step up and inherit that power. He violently secures it. He immediately has all his potential rivals executed, just completely silencing any challenge. And when the ancient city of Thebes dares to rebel against their new king, he entirely destroys the city and sells the entire surviving population into slavery. This wasn't just standard ancient politics. This was a chilling message written in blood to absolutely anyone who might even think about opposing him.
Section 2. Slaying the Persian Giant. The Impossible Odds.
Having crushed his neighbors through sheer terror, Alexander sets his sights on the reigning superpower of the ancient world, the vast, ridiculously wealthy Persian Empire. It's the spring of 334 BC, 40,000. That is the entire size of Alexander's Greek army. Against them stands a massive Persian force that swelled to an estimated 100,000 men. Just imagine standing on a dusty plain, looking out at a horizon completely filled with the finest soldiers from across a massive empire, knowing you're outmanned more than 2 to 1. No way you win that, right?
So how exactly do you beat a giant? Well, the secret weapon was the Macedonian phalanx. These highly trained professionals wielded this massive 18-foot iron-tipped pike called a sarissa, and they packed themselves tightly into a formation 16 ranks deep. It was essentially an unstoppable, moving wall of iron spear tips. The Persian forces, on the other hand, were heavily reliant on cavalry and armed with much shorter 8-foot spears. They simply couldn't penetrate it. Any charge against those Greek lines just turned into an absolute meat grinder. But here's the thing. Alexander's brilliant tactical mind was matched by a terrifying capacity for merciless violence. At his first major clash at the river Granicus, we see what ancient accounts actually describe as a blood rage. Greek mercenaries who were fighting for Persian gold found themselves completely trapped, and despite their desperate appeals for mercy, Alexander just ignored them. They were surrounded on all sides and massacred down to the absolute last man. The psychological warfare had begun, and his message was loud and clear. There is no mercy for anyone standing in my way.
Section 3. The God King of Babylon. Ascension and Awe.
Now, as Alexander started toppling armies that completely dwarfed his own, this highly dangerous psychological shift began to take root in his mind. And honestly, the sheer scale of the slaughter driving this new god complex is hard to even wrap your head around. After a staggering victory at Issus, one of his commanders reported seeing a ravine so deep and so completely packed with Persian dead that the Macedonian troops literally marched over the bodies. They used the dead as a human bridge. His divine ascension was quite literally being built on a mountain of corpses. And this terrifying obsession with his own divinity escalated rapidly. In 332 BC, he conquers Egypt without even having to fight, and is crowned Pharaoh in Memphis. Just a year later, priests at the remote desert oracle of Siwa welcome him as the son of Amun, basically declaring him the literal son of the king of the gods. So by the time he makes his victorious, grand entry into Babylon, recognized by Persian officials as its rightful ruler, Alexander isn't really just a king anymore. In his own mind, he is a living god.
And gods, as we know, often exact terrible vengeance. In early 330 BC, he reaches Persepolis, the magnificent ceremonial capital of the entire Persian Empire. Now, this was the major turning point. Instead of acting like a legitimate successor to the empire, he flips the script. He orders the magnificent city to be completely pillaged and burned to the ground as brutal retribution for past wars against Greece. It was a deeply ominous sign. The so-called liberator was now willingly embracing the role of the tyrant.
Section 4. Paranoia at the edge. The walls close in.
So, as the campaign pushes endlessly eastward into these remote, claustrophobic mountains, the whole story shifts into a dark, psychological thriller. What follows is a chilling, almost mafia-style sequence of betrayals. In 330 BC, he actually executes Philotas, the brilliant commander of his own elite cavalry, after torturing him over a rumored assassination plot. Then, Alexander immediately sends assassins to murder Philotas' father, General Parmenion. This was his most veteran, most loyal commander. Alexander had him killed before the old man could even hear of his son's death and potentially revolt. In 328 BC, during this furious, drunken argument, Alexander personally murders Cletus the Black, the very man who literally saved his life back at Granicus. And by 327 BC, his own official historian, Caliphanes, is implicated in a plot and thrown in a cage to die. The paranoia had completely taken the wheel.
But you have to ask, why was his inner circle fracturing so violently? Well, it really came down to an intense cultural clash that was tearing his army apart from the inside. See, traditional Greek culture heavily valued a sense of equality among leaders. Kings fought right alongside their men, in the mud and the blood. But Alexander started alienating his hardcore veterans by demanding the Persian ritual of proskynesis. He was forcing his Greek countrymen to prostrate themselves on the floor before him. To the Greeks, this was absolute, unforgivable blasphemy. Only a god was worthy of that kind of respect, and the resentment was just boiling over.
Yet he just pushed them onward, deeper into India, where the bloodshed somehow got even worse. At the Battle of the Hydaspes against King Porus, they faced what was basically a waking nightmare. Alexander's men encountered these terrifying giant war elephants that just trampled right through the phalanx, inflicting unprecedented bloody casualties on what was supposed to be his invincible army. So even though they won, the physical and mental toll of that battle was just devastating. And that is when we finally hit the breaking point. 8 years, thousands of miles, countless battles, standing at the river Hyphasis, mutiny. His profoundly exhausted men simply refused to take another step forward. The great, unstoppable conqueror was finally halted. Not by some massive enemy empire, but by the absolute, definitive refusal of his own loyal soldiers. They were just done.
Furious that his grand destiny was being denied, Alexander was forced to finally turn the army around. But let me tell you, the march back was an agonizing punishment. He intentionally led his men through the hellish Gadrosian desert in southern Pakistan. Extreme heat and starvation claimed thousands and thousands of lives. Nature essentially succeeded where entire armies had failed. And in his growing, wildly unpredictable anger, upon returning, Alexander started executing several of his own viceroys and governors, accusing them of robbing temples and ruling unjustly. His massive empire was now being held together entirely by fear.
Section 5. The Unsolved Final Mystery. Fall of the God King.
It all came to a dark, abrupt, and entirely unexpected end in Babylon. 32 years old. Think about that. At just 32, while actively planning his next massive campaign into Arabia, the man who had survived brutal close-quarters combat, desperate cavalry charges, and literally taking an arrow to the chest, developed a sudden, mysterious fever. Within days, he was dead. Was it malaria, typhoid, or, given the bloody trail of betrayed friends, murdered generals, and alienated soldiers he left in his wake, was it poison? At 32, the world's most powerful man was just gone, leaving the known world completely destabilized.
And the ultimate tragedy of his absolute power really hit in the immediate aftermath. What you should take away from this is that Alexander left absolutely no succession plan behind. The greatest empire the world had ever seen instantly fractured. His ambitious generals plunged everything into decades of bloody civil war, aggressively carving out their own kingdoms. And to secure their new power, they had Alexander's wife, Roxana, and his young son murdered. The conqueror's bloodline was violently and permanently erased from history.
Which leaves us with one final haunting question for you to ponder today. Where on earth is the hijacked gold sarcophagus of Alexander the Great? En route to Macedonia for his burial, his body was literally stolen by his own generals to legitimize their rule. It eventually ended up in Alexandria, Egypt, before vanishing from the historical record entirely. The man who sought to conquer the earth and live forever as a god lost his empire, lost his family, and ultimately lost his own physical legacy. The whereabouts of his body remains one of history's darkest unsolved mysteries. So what do you think happened to the God King? Think about that as we wrap up this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning the history you've been taught.